Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Beautiful setting for this lecture. This is the final in our series of lectures this summer, in our Capitol Hill Lecture Series, which we've organized in cooperation with Senator Rand Paul and his office. We have with us today two representatives of the Einhorn Family Foundation, Steve and Nancy Einhorn from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, God's country. Thank you so much for sponsoring this. It's been a great series focusing on a range of issues. Today we're going to be talking about a very important issue. And just to frame it, I just had a quick quotation I wanted to use from the book, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, published in 1956 by 20th century economist Ludwig von Mises. He wrote, "A nation is more prosperous today the less it has tried to put obstacles in the way of the spirit of free enterprise and private initiative. The people of the United States are more prosperous than the inhabitants of all other countries because their government embarked later than other governments in other parts of the world on the policy of obstructing business. Nonetheless, many people, and especially intellectuals, loathe capitalism." And I think we see in surveys falling support for capitalism. It's particularly concern among young people who seem to, in some of the surveys, favor socialism over capitalism. And many people in positions of power, including in the U.S. Congress, have taken to bashing capitalism and promoting socialism. And so I think hearing from our speaker today will help lay out some issues, and we'll have a great discussion following that. I'm going to introduce Senator Rand Paul to introduce our speaker. Senator Paul is truly a citizen politician, a professional in the medical field who came to Washington to try to make a difference, to speak out for the ideas of liberty and for our Constitution. And he's done so very effectively, and it's a pleasure for us to organize this series with him. Please welcome Senator Rand Paul.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks for coming. Thanks to the Einhorns. I always jokingly say, there is no such thing as a free lunch. The Einhorns are buying you lunch today, which is a great contribution because I think it's great to get such a good crowd to come and hear all our speakers. So thank you for helping with this program. Our speaker today is Matt Kibbe. He's a great voice. If you haven't seen his podcast, he does a podcast on Blaze TV. It's called Kibbe on Liberty. He has a wonderful book, which I think summarizes probably libertarianism in one title better than almost any short sentence could be. It's "Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff." He's president of Free the People, which is a nonprofit foundation that works to about reaching young people with the ideas of liberty. Give it up for my friend Matt Kibbe.
Thanks so much, Senator Paul. It's a pleasure to be here again, and thank you, Einhorns, for supporting this program. It's just awesome to be here. Thanks, TFAS. And thank all of you guys, because you probably could be doing something else, but you took the time to come here. And I want to start with, like all libertarians do, I want to start with my favorite book, Atlas Shrugged. Has anyone read Atlas Shrugged? It's a reading assignment. If you haven't read it, check it out. At the end of Atlas Shrugged, there's this iconic scene where a handful of entrepreneurs and creators and business people and people that were working hard to keep the American economy rolling. They're on a plane, they're leaving New York City, and the lights go out. And they very dramatically, Ayn Rand explains how the lights are going out as they're fleeing this government and this society where over a period of time they've nationalized everything. They've transferred private ownership into the public sphere. Now, 3 days ago, if you were reading the news, you read the New York Times, Caracas in Venezuela, the lights went out. And just a couple years ago, that would have been impossible to conceive of. Today, it's almost an afterthought because not just in Caracas, but all over Venezuela, which some 10 years ago was by any measure the wealthiest country in Latin America, rich with oil, rich with natural resources, very much a cosmopolitan city, Caracas. Now blackouts are a normal thing. And you have to ask yourself, why is that happening? You read the New York Times, you read other sources, and they attribute it to mismanagement. But of course, mismanagement is quite epic if you shut down the entire electricity grid of one of the most prosperous nations in Latin America. So maybe there's more to it. Well, you wouldn't be surprised that in 2007, I believe it was, before there was Nicolas Maduro, there was Hugo Chavez, and he was starting to nationalize everything. He famously nationalized the oil industry, he famously nationalized telecommunications, but he also took over the electricity grid because you didn't want private interests controlling something as important as whether or not you could cool your home, turn on the lights, cook lunch for your children. Well, the study of what has happened since then is a classic case of two economic traditions that I think a lot about. One, of course, would be Rhetoric and the problem with central planners not knowing enough to design and manage complex systems. Certainly an electricity grid, particularly one that runs on hydroelectric. This is not rocket science. There's fairly standard ways that you know how to do this. But of course the other problem is corruption. For all of the money that the Venezuelan government has invested in the provision of electricity, a lot of it ends up in offshore bank accounts of the public servant that was in charge of making sure that the people of Venezuela got electricity. But of course, electricity is the least of their problems. There's no food in Venezuela. The New York Times, not the Daily Caller, the New York Times says that 90% of Venezuelans today don't have enough money to buy food. Human rights, the Human Rights Watch, I had this somewhere. I wanted to cite sources that are not conservative. The Human Rights Watch, talking about the grassroots uprising against the Maduro regime, documents report after report of citizens getting executed, of citizens getting run down in the streets. If you Google protests in Venezuela, you will see a government armored vehicle running down protesters. This is how the government keeps track of everything today. Part of that is just standard, brutal, authoritarian regime change. And you can call that socialism, you can call it totalitarianism, you can call it fascism. I don't really care what you call it, but Hayek documents in Road to Serfdom the process by which people in power will do anything to stay in power. And that has nothing to do with ideology, that has to do with human nature. That's what's going on today. People are starving in the streets. Moms are waiting days in line to buy food for their children, and when they get inside of the grocery stores, there's no food, and of course, there's no lights. So how did that happen? Was it just mismanagement, or was it based on the idea that no individual can be trusted with the really precious things that matter to us: food, electricity, healthcare? We need to nationalize those things. We need to centralize those things. We need to make sure that the people are in charge instead of rich people. This, of course, was the platform that Hugo Chavez ran his first democratic election after he failed in his first attempt to take over the government. Was a military coup, but then he ran on a popular basis. And he was, by his own definition, some form of Marxist socialist. He was very much inspired by those ideas. Nicolas Maduro has doubled down on that. Nicolas Maduro has engaged a Marxist professor from Spain, a guy named Alfredo Serrano. Maduro, notably, refers to him as the Jesus Christ of economics. Let that sink in for a second. The Jesus Christ of economics. Implied in that term is that this Marxist professor knows everything, is omnipotent, but also is good enough. He's as good as Jesus, so you can trust him with all that power. The architect of the blockades, when moms couldn't get food for their kids in Venezuela, they would try to cross into Colombia. The architect of those blockades was Alfredo Serrano, because he thought that outside capitalist forces were corrupting the experiment to move from late-stage capitalism into a real socialist society. The architect, reportedly, of the blockades when Americans tried to send food in just recently was Alfredo Serrano. So is it about power? Is it the politics of controlling people through starvation? Or is it some ideology that says that there's a transition from capitalism to true communism that requires a little bit of suffering, a little bit of a reboot of how society works? If you read Marx himself, you will know that that transition, that arc of history, it's predetermined. Feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. And it's really beautiful over here. Communism is that place where nobody has to work, and nobody suffers from scarcity, and nobody controls who you are and what you do. In a lot of ways, it sounds like a beautiful thing, but Marx himself would say, and in practice, I think Nicolas Maduro would agree, I think Pol Pot and Mao Zedong would agree that the transition from capitalism to communism, socialism, is brutal. It's violent. It requires people to do things that they don't want to do, and if you centralized all these things, you have to use a lot of power in order to get people to comply. Somehow that magically goes away. We've never gotten there. But we do see real experiments in trying to pursue socialism in practice. And in effect, it always turns out the same. People starve, dissidents die, speech disappears, and all you get is human misery. Now, I tell that story, and if anybody's watching this and they're self-defined democratic socialists, they are already telling me that that's not socialism. Hugo Chavez, not a socialist. Nicolas Maduro, not a socialist. Alfredo Serrano, not a socialist. That's oligarchy, that's state capitalism, that's some sort of corruption of the process that in no way reflects what democratic socialists are trying to achieve today. I want to mention an article, once you've read Atlas Shrugged, you need to read an essay by one of my favorite economists, Rhetoric, called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And in that article, and the context for this is he's in the middle of this epic battle in the late 1940s between socialists on the one side and fascists on the other. And he's a classical liberal, he's arguing against both of these toxic ideologies, and he's trying to figure out how to convince his socialist colleagues that they can't possibly do what they say they're trying to do. And the first thing he says, and this is important for all of us who criticize socialism on a daily basis, is that if you want to persuade anyone, you need to take the other side seriously. You can't own the libs, as I see that everyone on Twitter likes to do today. I suppose you own the conservatives as well. But you actually have to listen to what the advocates of democratic socialism think that they believe, think that they're trying to accomplish. And you shouldn't assume that anybody, I don't think there's a single human being in America today that believes that the goal of socialism or any sort of political change would be parents starving and people not getting health care and protesters getting run down in the street. I don't think anybody wants that. And I think it's wrong to sort of impugn your intellectual opponents with these sorts of ideas. And he says other things as well. If, to the extent that you're just criticizing the socialists and coming off as if you're defending the status quo, everything's fine just the way it is, you're probably chasing young people in the opposite direction. The more you play that game, the more you own the libs, the more you just sort of make fun of socialism as a dumb and failed ideology, you're missing the point of people that are sort of seeking out real answers to real social problems. And so I'm going to go full Hayekian here, and I've spent a lot of time studying Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the rhetoric she uses and the ideas she espouses. She's not the only one. Obviously, Senator Bernie Sanders has talked a lot about democratic socialism. And I want to get at not the policies so much, but the ethos and the values that I think she talks about. You go back and you watch her initial video, the one that went viral, the one that helped her win her seat in Congress. And if you watch it with an open mind, and say you're a conservative or libertarian, you're watching it with an open mind, you will discover that she might be a Tea Partier. She might be Ron Paul libertarian. She might be a conservative because what she talks about, she doesn't talk about socialism. She doesn't talk about government control of the means of production. She talks about Washington, D.C. as this faraway place where insiders are gaming the system and how that is screwing her community back home. She talks about the incumbent. The incumbent doesn't live here. He lives there. He lives far away. He lives in Washington, D.C. He colluded with Wall Street to help bail them out. And none of them, nobody in D.C. understands the problems here back home. And she goes on to talk about this beautiful vision of people coming together, people with a shared set of values, people seeking economic dignity and trying to figure stuff out, and how we can solve problems at the local level. And I'm agreeing with her. I'm 100% in on that narrative. I think that's right. The rage against the machine, the insiders, the crony capitalists, and all of the people that are gaming the system, that could be a Ron Paul speech. Could be a Rand Paul speech. And then at the end, like in the last 10 seconds, she says, and that's why we need Medicare for all. That's why we need government to take over this, that, and the other. And so a fairly predictable set of things that people who want more government would do. And I wonder about that. I wonder about the disconnect between that very locavore vision that she has for how people get along, how people cooperate, how people tolerate each other, and the idea that the only way to get there is to centralize power in the very place that you are criticizing. Washington, D.C. needs more power because Washington, D.C. has too much power, and power attracts all the wrong sorts of people and guys like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg. They game the system. So why would you give that more power? If your goal is economic dignity, if your goal is community, if your goal is peaceful cooperation and tolerance among people from different religions and different backgrounds, and their parents came from different places, different skin colors, however you want to slice and dice modern identity, if your goal is to make that all work in this beautiful thing we call America, the most dangerous thing you can do is centralize power. And you see that play out today. We've gone from policy debates here in Washington, D.C., and arguably not only in this country but internationally, to what amounts to tribal warfare. It's us versus them. It's those guys and their religion and their skin color versus those guys and their traditions and their skin color. Ayn Rand, who I cited very early on, called racism the most primitive form of collectivism because it judges people based not on what they do or what they believe or how they feel about things. It judges them based on something they had no control over. And assume that everybody that looks like that is the same. Well, that's dangerous. It's toxic. Some of the worst tyrants in the world, by the way, not just fascists. Pol Pot was just as much of a racist as Adolf Hitler was. We're in a dangerous place in this country, and it feels like more and more the only way that one side feels satisfied is if they've completely defeated and crushed the other side on the political battlefield. And whoever's in charge, we're going to take charge, and we're going to use government and government power to implement the values and the priorities and the economics that matter most to us. Senator Mike Lee has what I think is a perfect constitutional conservative response to this sort of thing. He thinks that the American experiment thrives specifically because the founders were well aware of the fact that they were trying to organize a very diverse set of radically individualist individuals. We had freedom of religion, which back then was not a thing. We had all sorts of economic and and other diversities. And the way that the founders dealt with that is they did this thing called federalism. We don't all have to be the same. We don't all have to be governed by one central, top-down, one-size-fits-all authority. We don't have to be governed by the Jesus Christ of economics. In fact, that's insane and dangerous to ever assume that anybody could possibly know what you and I care most about. And that was Hayek's critique of socialism in the first place. How is it possible that any one person, even the smartest person, the most learned person, the most compassionate person, how could that person ever know what your hopes and dreams are? And multiply that by an infinite number of people across the United States, across the globe. How would they know what you know? How would they know what you don't know? And how would they ever figure out what was going to happen when all of these millions of individuals that they know nothing about interact and choose and build institutions and do all of the things that free people do? You don't know. You can't know. And part of the reason that socialism doesn't work is that they try anyway. Mao Zedong had the Great Leap Forward. He was going to industrialize what was an agricultural society in China. 45 million people starved to death. Pol Pot tried to do the same thing. I feel in a lot of ways that's what's happening in Venezuela today. It's not just about power, it's trying to get over the hump to where socialism doesn't suck so much anymore. And things start working, and people start eating again. I just don't think you can get there. And I think it's arrogant to think you can get there. It's that combination of not knowing, and there's not a person in this life that you can trust as much as Jesus. I'm going to throw that out there. Maybe somebody disagrees with me, but that's my theory at least. So what do you do with all that? And what do you do with young people that are telling us that they now are more attracted to socialism versus capitalism? You've all seen the scare polls, and I wouldn't put too much weight into that, but it's very clear to me that a lot of young people, they're registering independent, they're trying to figure out how the world works. They're looking at the two tribes and they're saying, you know what, I'm not down with tribalism. I don't want to join a team. I want to figure this stuff out for myself. And I feel like the answer is to take young democratic socialists seriously and to take that vision of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and try to fill in some of the blanks. Because I do believe that the great things in life come from the bottom up. I do believe that everything that is beautiful in life is the result of people, face to face, community by community, working together to do something that they couldn't have possibly done by themselves. This is Hayek's entire vision. He calls it the spontaneous order. I call it beautiful chaos. Because you look at it from the outside, you look at it as a central planner, as someone that wants to make sure that certain things happen, and it looks like a mess. How is it possible that people just do stuff? Well, that's how civil society works. That's why America is a great place. It's because we respect that local, focused, individualistic approach to achieving our hopes and dreams. So maybe the libertarian vision, the idea that we're not going to judge people based on the color of their skin, we're not going to judge people based on who they are or where they go to church, if they go to church at all, what they do for a living, all of those thousands of intersections that make us different from each other, we're not going to judge you based on that. We're going to judge you based on whether or not you're part of a cooperative system by which we figure stuff out, by which we help our fellow man by creating stuff, by which we solve problems when we see a neighbor in trouble. All of these beautiful things that happen on a daily basis, millions and millions of times, you and I don't even know about it. All we know is that it works. And all we know is that by and large, it's never violent. By and large, people never starve to death. By and large, beautiful, awesome things happen that you and I could not have conceived of. So are we Switzerland? Are we a paradigm shift? I don't know, but I think those of us that believe in liberty feel like our audience for these ideas and these values It can come from conservatives, it can come from progressives, it can come from, gasp, democratic socialists. We can connect with all of these people, and I think that's exactly what America is all about. Thank you guys so much.